History has focused on the clash of swords, but the true theater of ancient war was the siege, a grim, terrifying waiting game. For millennia, great civilizations invested their very essence into walls. They were not mere stone. They were the collective promise of safety. Look at the walls of Jericho, the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. These were monuments to defiance, seemingly impossible to breach. The psychological effect of these walls was immense. To the defender, they were salvation. To the attacker, an insult. Our story begins not with the first volley, but with the moment the besieging army appears on the horizon. The dust cloud, a distant tremor, then the slow, terrifying materialization of thousands of enemies. The air itself changes. The initial sight of the enemy was a deliberate terror tactic, a parade of power meant to shake the resolve of the city's leadership. They wouldn't attack immediately. They would simply wait. This was the first, most powerful blow. The ancient military mind understood that a city is a fragile ecosystem, isolated, and the life within begins to devour itself. The siege was a total war against three things: the stone, the stomach, and the soul. The initial action was almost ceremonial, the methodical destruction of surrounding farms and water sources. The conqueror didn't need to fight his way in. He simply needed to let hunger do his work for him. The subtle change in the city's mood, from defiant shouting on the ramparts to a quiet, anxious rationing. The true battle wasn't on the outside. It was the internal clock ticking down to famine. They call it attrition. We call it the slow, agonizing death of hope. But the besieged were not passive. They knew their land. They had subterranean secrets, underground conduits, hidden springs, secret caches of grain. These were the city's lifeblood and the first targets. The conqueror's scouts weren't looking for weakness in the stone. They were hunting for the slightest trace of water flowing. Imagine the dread as the water level drops, or the unthinkable moment when the rations are cut in half, then a quarter. The sounds of the besiegers' camp were also carefully curated: rhythmic hammering, the eerie cadence of chanting. A constant, audible threat. It was a constant reminder: they are working. They are closer. You are trapped. When walls proved too high, the ancient world created monsters to match them. The siege tower. But the tower wasn't just a military structure. It was a terrifying spectacle, an engine of psychological despair. It was a deliberate act of scaling the enemy's defense, proving that no height was safe, no wall too thick. The immense effort to build these structures was itself a mind game. The city watched its inevitable execution scaffold rise. The defenders, in turn, developed ingenious countermeasures: Greek fire, giant cranes, and boiling oil. The age of desperate innovation. Yet, the greatest threats came not from above, but from below. The silent, terrifying world of sapping. In the darkest hours, engineers would tunnel beneath the foundation, aiming not for the wall, but for the very earth supporting it. It was a secret war of silence and darkness, waged with picks, sweat, and absolute desperation. The defenders listened for the sounds of the tunneling, a faint, rhythmic scraping in the bedrock, a ghost beneath their feet. Finding a sap was a literal race against time. The moment a countermine was dug, the true subterranean battle began. In the suffocating blackness, two armies collided with no quarter given, a terrifying, claustrophobic death match. But what if the conqueror didn't want to fight? What if he wanted to buy his way in? The lure of gold, the promise of freedom. Treachery was the cheapest, most efficient siege weapon ever devised. Letters thrown over the wall, bribes whispered to guards, creating a subtle, corrosive paranoia within the city's elite. Who can you trust? Is the commander loyal? Is the guard at the gate secretly plotting your demise? The city turned on itself. This is the conqueror's masterpiece, convincing the city to defeat itself. We turn now to Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre, a coastal fortress considered unassailable. Tyre was an island, a mile offshore, a fortress protected by the sea itself. Alexander's response was a feat of engineering hubris. He built a massive causeway to the island, an act of sheer will. The Tyrians watched, stunned, as the sea was replaced by a path for their destruction, an act designed to inspire awe and despair. This wasn't merely military strategy. It was a declaration of divine mandate. The ocean itself could not stop him. The sheer scale of the engineering effort, the movement of rock, dirt, and timber, was a testament to relentless focus. The defenders fought back with fire ships and divers, creating chaos, but the relentless pace of construction never stopped. The causeway grew centimeter by centimeter, an unstoppable, terrifying monument to human ambition. The defenders of Masada watched a different kind of impossible structure rise, a vast earthen ramp. Built by thousands of Jewish slaves, the ramp was a psychological trap. They were forced to build their own execution platform. The Roman general understood that forcing the enemy to watch the inevitability of their doom was the final, devastating blow. The mind begins to break long before the final assault. It starts with the realization there is no escape. The question shifts from if we will fall to when and how brutally. Ancient commanders were masters of information warfare. False flags, fake parleys, and deliberate misinformation. They would launch a massive, coordinated attack on one gate, only to quietly ready the battering ram at a much weaker section. The goal was to force the defenders to commit all their forces, leaving key weaknesses critically exposed. This misdirection was the moment the city's defense strategy fractured into panicked reaction. The final breach is super loud, totally chaotic, and honestly pretty scary, but it often ends up feeling a bit anticlimactic, you know? The true psychological collapse occurred hours, or even days, before the wall fell. The sounds now are different. The roar of the ram, the triumphant shouts of the attackers, and the sudden, awful silence of surrender. Consider the fate of Carthage. After 3 years of siege, the city was taken, and the human cost was staggering. Survivors weren't immediately killed. They were marched out, visible, a graphic lesson for any other city considering resistance. The conqueror's final psychological weapon, the performance of overwhelming, absolute power. But the story of siege warfare is also a story of extraordinary defiance and hidden ingenuity. The citizens of Plataea, besieged by the Spartans, didn't fight over the walls, they escaped over them. Using ladders measured against brick counts, and moving only under the cover of a freezing storm, they simply left. It was a victory of wits over walls, a testament to the enduring, unbreakable human will to survive. The psychological game went both ways. The defenders had their own tricks, their own silent, devastating forms of warfare. They would display massive loaves of bread or throw fat animals over the wall, a desperate lie to convince the enemy of their plenty. The hope was to sow doubt in the attacker's mind. Is this siege worth the cost? Are we the ones being starved? The psychological impact of this reversal could be immediate, causing the besiegers to question their own leadership and intelligence. We see this at Alesia, where Julius Caesar found himself both besieger and besieged. He built a wall around the city, and then another wall facing outward to defend against a relief army. Caesar placed his entire army in a psychological pressure cooker, betting on his own men's resilience and the enemy's panic. The city's defenders watched in horror as their relief force was utterly crushed between the two rings of Roman power. This was a mind game played on an epic scale, a double layer of psychological dread that proved unbeatable. The enduring lesson of siege warfare is not about the technology of destruction, but the technology of belief. The walls stood as long as the people inside believed they could stand. Once that belief fractured, the stone became irrelevant. The city had already surrendered in its heart. The most terrifying silence in ancient warfare wasn't the lull before the storm, but the silence after the city fell. The quiet aftermath, the smoke, the empty streets, the chilling realization of absolute conquest. The Roman legions, masters of siegecraft, understood that conquest was an act of psychological dominance. They weren't just taking land. They were taking the ability of future generations to resist. Their very methods, the straight, brutal lines of their camps, the rhythmic efficiency, were designed to intimidate. But what happens to the land that holds a siege? Does the memory of that desperation linger? Look at the ruins, the broken stones, the scorched earth. These are not just remnants of war. They are a physical record of human anguish, of the agonizing choice between surrender and annihilation. The stones whisper stories of hunger, of fear, of last-minute heroism, and of the inevitable human weakness. Siege warfare teaches us that resilience is not a physical attribute. It is a psychological one. It is the final, desperate decision to stand firm, even when the logic of survival has abandoned you. So, the next time you look upon an ancient fortress, remember the walls are only half the story. The other half is the human drama, the war of wits, terror, and the mind games that decided the fate of empires. The real battlefield was always within, and the true conqueror was always the one who could break the human soul. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.